in budgeting. As it turns out, a few years later, a reporter from the Statesman, the Austin American Statesman, got a hold of that graphic and said, "This is great." And he ended up publishing that graphic in the newspaper a number of years ago. But this is an example of the graphic that I prepared for the Wildflower Center, which charts its main revenue streams, different earned income sources like admissions, store sales, special events, private events, memberships, investment earnings, philanthropy, and then where all that money goes to, and then in terms of different operating departments, different types of expense, such as payroll, contracts, maintenance costs, travel, and then how money flows between different accounts. In the case of UT, money flows, related to earnings from endowments to help fund operations. Sometimes money flows from operations to fund capital improvements. Sometimes you have an organization has debt service. You have to flow money from your operating accounts to pay your debt service. So I find it very helpful to have a deep understanding of your financial flows. And then within each of those flows, you need to understand the seasonality and other factors affecting each of these different streams of revenues and expenditures. What I've always found helpful is don't assume you know it all. I go to managers, staff, and query them. What are driving those elements of revenue or expense that are impacting your specific program or activity or department? Question is often, do revenues drive expenses, or do expenses drive revenues? For example, we have a gift shop at the Wildflower Center. Revenues heavily drive expenses. Our largest source of expense there is the cost of buying the merchandise. Well, we don't need to buy more merchandise unless we've had revenue to sell the merchandise that we have in hand. So in that case, the revenue is driving the expense. Other times, expenses can drive revenues. For example, we have in the winter, a program called Luminations, where we do a light display and attract tens of thousands of guests. Well, in order to have that light display available for those guests who want to attend, we had to spend a lot of money on renting and installing the display. In that case, the expense was there, and we're hoping for the revenue, but the expense was driving the revenue, because without that expense, there would be no revenue. Other things, what are the impacts of weather, economic conditions, the pandemic, societal changes? At the Wildflower Center, we're heavily impacted by weather. Right now, we've been blessed with great weather this spring, and we've had tens of, 1,000 to 2,000 visitors a day, bringing in revenue. Now, if we have a rainy day on a Saturday or Sunday, that impacts our revenue, because the people are not going to come to a garden on a rainy day. Also, our revenue is impacted by a late bloom. This year, we had some cold weather, caused our bloom of wildflowers to be about 3 weeks later than usual. That directly impacted our revenue. Economic conditions drive revenues for all sorts of nonprofits, especially as it relates to their donations. And for some nonprofits, economic conditions drive the demand for their services. In harder times, people are in more need of support from social services agencies. We've all been through the pandemic with COVID-19. At the Wildflower Center, we shut down on May 15th of 2020, which was really the first day of our spring busy season. We lost an entire year's worth of busy spring wildflower activity. It cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue. And then other societal changes impact revenues and expenses. In doing your budget, it's important to look at several years worth of your transaction data to understand your trends, know what anomalies are. For example, the pandemic has been a huge anomaly to both impact both revenues and expense streams. So as you're doing your budget for next year, know that how expenses and revenues in 2020 and 2021 were impacted. Be aware of cost increases. Right now, we're very much in an inflationary mode. I know that we are feeling pressure to increase salaries in response to market changes in salaries. That's definitely changing the economics and changing how we develop our budget for next year. We're having to set aside additional money in order to retain the employees we've got and to be able to attract new employees as there is turnover. Be aware of utilization increases in services. One of the things that I've observed is we've had a large increase in our visitation, resulted in increase in revenue, and we've moved all of our transactions to credit card transactions in terms of our guests purchasing admissions tickets and other items on site. We no longer handle cash. Well, the immediate impact of that has been an increase in our credit card fees because we have a near approximately 3% credit card fee on all merchant account transactions. We have to budget for that. Be aware of maintenance and costs and repair increase with costs. And also be aware of capital outlay and new equipment replacements. It's especially with technology. Technology has a life cycle these days of 3 to 4 years maximum. If you have a bunch of PCs, you need to be ready to cycle them through. Things as simple as credit card readers, we're learning, have to be replaced as the service providers are upgrading their software, requiring replacing hardware in order to keep up with the required software. Next thing you do when you're building budgets, after you understand your streams, I build models. Let me just make sure I'm on the right slide here. For my payroll and my budgets. And I link those models together. So my models have summaries at all levels. So I look at the 50,000 foot view or in the weeds views. Sometimes it's necessary to get into the weeds, but if you're stuck in the weeds, you don't get the overall perspective. So allows me to slice and dice and looking at both revenues and expenses. And one of the key things I've learned over the years is as you're building your models, label and save updated versions. So if you make a mistake, you don't have to reinvent your wheel. In this graphic, what I'm depicting is I have a payroll model that has salaries and benefits by department and position. And another view of that looks at the salaries and benefits by department and funding source. And these payroll models feed into budget models that allow me to look at budgets by department and line item, and then budgets by funding source and line item.
Hey, Mike, I just wanted to let you know we've got 2 minutes left.
Okay, so just as a quick view, I've built a payroll model that lists each position. I realize this is hard to see. And then the payroll model is linked to a budget model that has salaries and benefits. So and my budget model for salaries and benefits has different pages, different tabs for each of the departments that rolls up to a grand total. And then there's other levels of summary sheets that are all linked. So within my models, I can change a salary in the payroll model, and it automatically updates and flows through all the different versions of the budget model. And then it's important then that I keep my models in sync. So I have a payroll model version 8 and a budget model version 8. And as I update the payroll model and update the budget model, I do a version 9 and another version 9. Finally, budgeting is it's an iterative process. I first develop an initial budget based on looking at last year's actual expenses and revenues, this year's year to date, project out the remainder of this year. I want to know what my trends are and what changes will be, and develop a proposed budget for each line item, both on the revenue and the side and on the expense side. And in the back of my mind, I have wish lists for items that maybe could be added. I summarize my proposed departmental budgets and look to see, am I in a shortfall situation or a surplus? Usually there's a shortfall. Usually there's more expenses than there are revenues available.
That's true.
And then in an iterative process, I do second, third, fourth, or more iterations. When I was at the city, there were 20 different iterations until we finally got that balanced budget. But in doing so, you need to consider opportunities for efficiency and savings, increased revenue. You have to look at staffing changes, reorganizations, possibly new opportunities for fundraising. Look at your revenue streams. Can you increase your pricing? Can you change some of your expenses by renegotiating contracts or changing vendors? Can you re-engineer systems and processes to make things more efficient or bring more money in? It's a detailed process, and you continue making your changes, tweaking and time until the budget is balanced. And then once your budget is balanced, it's really important to consider having a contingency or reserve in case your guesstimates are wrong, if revenues don't work out. One of the things, fortunately for the Wildflower Center, before the pandemic hit, we had a few $100,000 in reserve. That we needed that when we had the spring of 2020 hit and our revenues dried out. We were glad we had that few $100,000 in reserve. So that is budgeting from the bottom up in a nutshell. I realize there's a lot of information, but encourage anybody who'd like to reach out and contact me at Abkowitz at wildflower.org. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Quick question is, if somebody wants the PowerPoints, are you willing to share those?
Certainly.
Okay. All right. Yeah, sometimes people will email me afterwards for information or questions, so I'll let you know. And I wanted to thank you very much, Mike, for coming today, sharing your time and your experience with us. And yes, if anybody wants more information, let us both know. And please join us this Thursday for our meetup, Raise More Funds with Best Practices for Donor Management. And if you have not experienced Stephen Shattuck of Bloomerang, you're in for a real treat and a lot of guidance in donor management. So please sign up. There's, I think, 1.5 more days to sign up. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.